Just about every character in Gravity Falls has a tragic backstory. A misunderstanding and parents of high expectations led to Stan and Ford falling out, before a brief reunion spiraled into them getting separated for 30 years. Seuss has a deadbeat dad, Wendy's mom is no longer with us, Dipper and Mabel might have gotten sent to Gravity Falls so their parents could work through a divorce, and I don't even know where to begin with Pacifica. But the most tragic character in all of Gravity Falls by far would have to be Fiddle Hadron McGucket. This man put his dreams on hold to help make someone else's dream a reality, and it led to a downward spiral. Unable to process the cruel and disturbing world he resided in, he became addicted to something that destroyed his mind in a desperate attempt to escape. Yet, at the end of the day, he was never able to forget his past completely, and his actions always came back to haunt him. Earlier this year, I started breaking down the arcs of major characters in my favorite cartoons, and it's time for Gravity Falls to be added to the rotation, with a deep dive into everyone's favorite hillbilly, whose journey is a tearjerker to say the least. This is the tale of Old Man McGucket, the scholar who lost his mind. Also, if you're new to the channel or feeling a stroll down memory lane, be sure to check out Roundtable Rewind, a new channel that has a bunch of Roundtable videos old and new, re-edited into themed compilations. We got 4 out right now on Gravity Falls, Steven Universe, Regular Show, and a variety of cartoon insanity that you can check out with more on the way. Now let's talk about McGucket. Born between the 1950s and 1960s on a hog farm in Tennessee, McGucket came from a financially poor background, something that presumably limited his options for college as he attended Backuthmore University in the mid-70s. It's a telling but overlooked detail. I mean, look at Ford. He only went to Backuthmore because his plans to going to West Tech went up in smoke after his science project was destroyed. Something similar must have happened to Fiddleford for him to end up here as well, despite being very intelligent. For one reason or another, he couldn't swing a scholarship to anywhere else, and this was the only college he could afford. For better or for worse, Backuthmore changed the trajectory of Fiddleford's life in ways he could never imagine, as he would wind up becoming roommates with Stanford Pines, an aspiring paranormal investigator, who viewed Fiddleford as a brilliant mechanic brimming with potential. The two bonded over how much they have in common, their similar backgrounds, their quirks, and interests. It was a match made in heaven. The two made their college experience unforgettable. After graduation, Fiddleford moved to Palo Alto, California, where he would eventually meet and marry a woman by the name of MMA Dixon, although not much is known about her. But she may have a relative named Malin Dixon, who was once a part of a cult named Cyphertology. You can guess who they worshipped. Fiddleford and MMA would go on to have a son named Tate, the three living as a happy family. Fiddleford had also decided to become his own boss, starting up Fiddleford Computer Majigs, developing a ton of hardware and devices like laptops, which may not have been popular at the time, but we know would catch on in a couple of decades. So at this point, my guy McGucket owned his own company, which definitely has parallels with Apple, meaning if he stayed locked in with his career, he would have ended up as a multi-billionaire, and he has a loving family. He was on track to win at life. What could possibly go wrong? Well, a call from his old roommate, Stanford Pines, who was looking to recruit Fiddleford for a special project, something that could be a huge breakthrough for the scientific community. He wants to build a portal. Leaving his family and career behind for someone else's dream, McGucket arrived in Gravity Falls on July 29th, 1970X. Stanford was cognizant of the fact that Fiddleford put his life on hold for an undetermined amount of time to create something that may not even work. Writing in Journal 3, he has sacrificed so much to come to my aid. He has temporarily left his bride and their young son behind in California for the duration of this project. He has abandoned his own professional aspirations, although he has brought along a prototype of his pet project to fiddle with in his off hours. Ford was excited to have a friend around to help out and keep him company after years of solitude, minus the mind-surfing triangle taking up real estate in his brain. He was endeared by McGucket's quirks and did his best to make him feel at home, buying him banjo strings and microchips the day he arrived. But Ford wasn't a fan of his tobacco chewing, believing it was something that carried over from McGucket's days on the hog farm, and that old habits die hard. I do think this illustrates that McGucket, like most adults, has his vices. Something that isn't necessarily healthy for him, but he still relies on, regardless of the effects it has on his body. Hey, something smells like foreshadowing. McGucket also has a habit of pulling his hair out when stressed. Wonder if that'll amount to anything in the future. Despite the warm welcome to Gravity Falls, and really enjoying his time spent with Ford, McGucket was often caught staring at a photo of his family, stating that thinking of his loved ones keeps him grounded. Ford, not being on the greatest terms with his family, equated the sentimental value to a photo he has of Nikola Tesla. Yeah, not the exact same thing, but you got the spirit, buddy. Still, Fiddleford tried to immerse himself in his environment and developed a fun dynamic with Stanford, who would do things like rearrange McGucket's Kubik's Cube just to see how impressively fast McGucket would solve it. When Christmas rolled around, McGucket surprised Ford with handmade gifts, a snow globe of their lab, and 6-fingered gloves. These really showed how much McGucket cared about Ford and believed in their project, in spite of how impossible it may have seemed. Sadly, Ford didn't think to get McGucket anything, but McGucket didn't sweat it. Still a little sad. Taking a break for the holidays, Fiddleford flew home to visit his family. However, he got into a fight with MMA when he came home, as he returned empty-handed. Let that sink in. He made incredibly thoughtful gifts for Ford, but not his wife. It really highlights how Ford and this project has taken priority over everything else. Ford is starting to consume his life, and Fiddleford is getting nothing but pain in return. And speaking of Ford, McGucket's fight with his wife allowed him to get back to Gravity Falls just in time to rescue Ford from Krampus's wrath. Ford, feeling guilty and indebted to his colleague, tries to return the favor by cheering him up and reluctantly getting into the holiday spirit, decorating the portal with lights and ornaments while playing Fiddleford's favorite Christmas music. It's really sweet. The two spent the rest of the night building snowmen and reminiscing about the past. Things weren't all sunshine and rainbows, however, as their personalities clashed every so often. McGucket was apparently very superstitious, which seemed to annoy Ford. McGucket would cross himself whenever he walked past a grave, and scolded Ford for saying things like, "What the devil?" God, these geeks. Superstitions weren't the extent of McGucket's anxiety, however, as McGucket began to suspect that Ford had another partner, due to how unbelievably complex the portal blueprints were. We know that McGucket was right on the money, as Ford already had a working relationship with Bill Cipher. But of course, Ford lied and insisted he pulled this off on his own, partially because of how superstitious McGucket is, but also because Ford didn't want him to accuse Bill of being some sort of dark magic, which Ford, buddy. He kinda is. You had to read an incantation in a dark spooky cave to summon him. Get a grip, bud. One day, McGucket came to Ford alarmed that a functioning portal would require a hyperdrive, something humans wouldn't be able to invent for another 10,000 years. Thankfully, they didn't have to wait that long, as Ford already knew where they could get their hands on one. They just had to hit up the giant UFO at Crash Site Omega, which would require a 2-day expedition. Throughout this trek, McGucket encountered a spectrum of Gravity Falls weirdness, from creatures he found charming or resourceful, like the platypus and geodites, to those he found disturbing and creepy, such as the Hide Behind, which stole his banjo, and the giant skeleton of a dinosaur. Some of Ford's selfish tendencies became apparent during this expedition, especially his habit of putting his curiosity and research ahead of McGucket's safety. He assumed that Fiddleford would adapt to all of this weirdness like he has, when in reality, it's a lot for the guy to process, especially when so much of it is being thrown at him all at once. But Fiddleford lets it go for the time being, as he knows Ford isn't acting out of malicious intent, and how can he be mad when they get to stargaze, share their ambitions with one another, and explore a freaking spaceship? All things considered, he's having the time of his life. Until everything crashed and burned. Ford's ego and habit of disregarding McGucket's safety would lead to McGucket getting severely injured and deeply traumatized, as on their way back home from Crash Site Omega, the two encountered a sleeping gremlin. It's half gremlin, half goblin. You should remember one of these bad boys from season 1. Instead of getting out of dodge, Ford was insistent on sketching the gremlin while it slumbered, much to McGucket's dismay. Stanford was confident that he'd be able to get a good illustration without disturbing the beast, only for the hyperdrive to emit an alarm from McGucket's backpack. In response, the gremlin awoke and attacked McGucket, staring right into his eyes and forcing upon a vision of the man's greatest fear, stunning McGucket as Ford scrambled to rescue him, knocking out the gremlin after using his magnet gun to latch onto the hyperdrive. You guys following all of this? This isn't just a pile of scientific mumbo jumbo coming out of my mouth. McGucket was left in a state of shock, with a broken arm that was riddled with venomous quills from the Gremlin. While Ford was able to treat McGucket's physical wounds, the mental scars of this event would linger for many years to come. Ford didn't realize how severe McGucket's trauma was until he noticed that McGucket stopped solving his Rubik's Cube, leaving it untouched for days on end, on top of struggling to sleep at night. He was truly disturbed by what the Gremlin showed him. Ford tried to comfort his dear friend with meditation techniques, reminding him that as scientists, their creativity can solve any problem they face. But McGucket took this advice and pivoted into a much different direction from what Ford intended, resolving his problems by not confronting them head on, but by burying them. Eager to forget what he's seen, Fiddleford created the memory gun. Now, to this point, you may be thinking, hey, didn't McGucket create the memory gun after he quit working for Ford?
I decided to quit the project, but I lie awake at night, haunted by the thoughts of what I've done.
And the answer is, it's a retcon, bro. The timeline of Fiddleford's descent into madness that's mapped out in Society of the Blind Eye doesn't add up with the extended canon found in Journal 3, or the Book of Bill. The show makes it seem like Fiddleford created the memory gun a year into working with Ford after parting ways. But then the show would later contradict itself by having Ford recognize the memory gun and tell it to stand, so the corrected timeline is him inventing the memory gun after the Gremlin incident. But since he's used it on himself so much, there could be a darker recontextualization to this scene. Maybe when he recorded this first log, McGucket thought he just invented the portal gun, when in reality, it already existed for quite some time. That's how wrecked his brain was by the time he left Ford's project. On that note, we should probably talk about what the memory gun is a clear allegory for: substance abuse. At least for Fiddleford and the members of the society. Everyone else, it's just a horrifying device that can destroy your brain. I mean, on its face, this is an exploration of the phrase, drink to forget. McGucket uses the memory gun as a vice, to relieve stress by erasing traumatic events from his memory. And the more he relies on it, the greater of a toll it takes on his body. He starts to struggle with his words, he's acting more erratic, his mood swings from happy to sad, and he struggles to remember anything. And after abusing the memory gun so much, he's a lot more senile in the present day than other characters like Stan, Ford, or Susan, despite being around their age. Cartoons love having their substance abuse stand-ins. Almost like that's a problem in entertainment or something.
You made me feel alive.
Ford was immediately turned off by the memory gun, as he was concerned for both its effects on McGucket and the possibility of it falling into the wrong hands. What if the blowback from the gun affected the user? Is the memory loss permanent? What happens if there's a typo? And the fact it can be used on a wide scale was pretty alarming. Not wanting to risk anything, Ford voices his concerns and demanded that McGucket destroy the memory gun. McGucket was initially taken aback by Ford's stance, feeling disappointed, but then claimed to be in agreement with Ford. But when journaling about this encounter, Ford can't quite remember how the conversation wrapped up because McGucket wiped his memory. Dude is already on a very dark path with his memory gun. Still trying to cheer McGucket up from the Gremlin incident, Stanford invites him out to a day at the carnival, something Ford wasn't entirely fond of, but he was willing to give it another shot if it meant making his bud feel better with pig races and kettle corn. At this carnival, Fiddleford would end up fixing gears on a broken Ferris wheel and network with a carny, Ivan Wexler. Ivan opened up about being bullied by his coworkers for his head tattoos, which led to a traumatic incident where they locked him in a haunted house for an entire night. So behind Ford's back, Fiddleford gave Ivan a piece of paper with a strange symbol on it. A symbol that I'd wager looked something like this. This means that sometime after being confronted by Ford and wiping his memory, McGucket already founded the Society of the Blind Eye, a secret society where those disturbed by the supernatural occurrences in Gravity Falls, or those just looking to escape their troubles, could gather to have their bad memories erased. Basically, it's the Anti-Alcoholics Anonymous. While I'm sure it was operating on a much smaller scale, it's still crazy to think that Stanford wanted Fiddleford to destroy the gun before it could fall into the wrong hands, only for it to ultimately end up mass-produced and circulating throughout town right under his nose. Fiddleford was spiraling, refusing to process anything he witnessed in favor of getting literally blasted. And in this emotionally stunted state, he grew afraid and paranoid of not only the world, but himself, worried that the world will end because of him and Ford. Desperate to quell his anxiety, McGucket came up with a plan to build some sort of fallout shelter in case an apocalyptic event struck. He proposed a maximum security bunker under the guise of a second lab to study any creatures that may come through the portal, reasoning that Ford easily bought into. Fiddleford took the reins of building the bunker, enlisting the help of local lumberjacks to speed up the process, only to wipe their memory of the whole thing as a way to avoid compensation while throwing Ford off his tracks. Yeah, in case you couldn't tell, McGucket's a bit of a dick by this point. A tragic dick, but a dick nonetheless. He's become very manipulative and secretive. Which still isn't too off from Ford, actually. You can feel the magnitude of Fiddleford's paranoia through every aspect of the bunker. Its hiding spot deep in the woods, its elaborate entrance, the observation room keeping a safe distance between them and any potential subjects, the security system that's reminiscent of his Cubics cube. All these drastic measures were the work of a man who's terrified that he's making massive mistakes and he doesn't know how to step down. Despite this bunker being effective at keeping trouble out, the next traumatic event in Fiddleford's life came from something they invited into their sanctuary themselves: the shapeshifter. Ford found the shapeshifter when it was an infant, somewhere near the bunker, and despite Fiddleford's wishes to freeze it immediately, Ford decided to keep it around as a sort of pet. And as it rapidly grew, Fiddleford also grew. Grew skeptical, that is! McGucket made it known that he wasn't attached to this life form like Ford, equating it to livestock on a farm. They only kept it around so they could test the bunker's cryogenics. McGucket would be proven right to distrust the shapeshifter when it broke out of its cage, assuming McGucket's form and locking him up in a cabinet, and immediately attempting to read Ford's journal to gain access to a catalog of new forms. Thankfully, Ford and McGucket were able to stop the shapeshifter, but Fiddleford had now been pushed to the brink of insanity. Following this incident, he was more than ready to return to his normal life. So the two went full steam ahead with finishing the portal. Although McGucket still remained suspicious of Ford, as the work he was getting done seemed superhuman, as if he couldn't pull it off himself. But despite his partner's curiosities, Ford refused to come clean about his involvement with Bill. Leading up to the portal test, McGucket and Stanford went out to dinner, where McGucket expressed his concerns about the project. He revealed that he calculated the probability of failure, and the odds were stacked against them. They were setting themselves up for utter catastrophe. He pressed Ford one last time to come clean about any other partners, yet Ford continued to deny anyone else's involvement. So, making one last plea to drop all of this, Fiddleford also revealed that he compiled all of Stanford's research into a book that's ready for publishing. Ford could shut down the project right now, achieve fame and fortune for what he's already accomplished, and walk away from all of this. But Ford refused, as he was afraid that would just allow Gravity Falls to become open season to other scientists who could mooch off of his research. He simply couldn't give up the idea of being the best and most notable, which he couldn't achieve if he gave up now. This led to Strike 3, the incident that broke Fiddleford, the portal test. Thanks to an oversight, Fiddleford was thrown into the portal instead of the crash dummy. Fiddleford caught horrifying glimpses of the Nightmare Realm, with the most notable sight being Bill Cipher removing his exoskeleton to feed. Yeah, horrifying. This brief moment in the Nightmare Realm also imbued Fiddleford with a premonition. When gravity falls and Earth becomes sky, fear the beast with just one eye. If the portal is fully operational, it will bring about the end of the world. After seeing horrors beyond human comprehension, Fiddleford finally quit the project and threw himself fully into the Society of the Blind Eye, although it wouldn't be long until he was no longer fit to lead, causing the society to fall into the hands of Blind Ivan. With McGucket's memory erasing activity at an all-time high, he devolved into a state of a crazy old man within just a year. This was the start of his lowest point. Prolonged exposure to the memory gun has transformed Fiddleford's appearance from Professor Shaggy to a starving Victorian Santa Claus. He's leaning fully into the hillbilly aesthetic, wearing suspenders and a hat from a scarecrow. All of his hair fell out, he's gained a gold tooth, and he refuses to wear shoes, calling them foot prisons. He also wears a cast on his arm that apparently emits a humming sound, causing Dipper to suspect that he could be turning himself into a robot, which might just be a naive observation from a kid, but it's sad to think that McGucket took a crack at fixing himself by trying to turn himself into a cyborg. Then there's my favorite part about McGucket's present day look, the mysterious bandage on his beard. According to Dipper, if you try to take it off, he will growl at you like a small dog. It's my favorite detail because when Society of the Blind Eye just came out, I caught a rerun with my uncle who was visiting. And he kept pointing out the bandage on McGucket's beard, and then McGucket himself pointed it out, and my uncle was all like, "That's what I'm saying!" And that in itself reminded me of any time Santa's talking to the TV in the show. So it's just a fond memory all around. I'm sure you all value this tangent in the middle of the McGucket analysis you clicked on. Or autoplay let it roll and you just didn't fight back. After he became hooked to the memory gun and shattered his mind, McGucket eventually lost contact with his family. His wife divorced him and his son became too embarrassed to even associate with him. But since Fiddleford is from California, why is Tate even working all the way out in Gravity Falls? I'm guessing that he actually moved out to Gravity Falls to support his dad after the divorce, only to get frustrated with McGucket's claims that Gravity Falls is full of supernatural weirdness without anything to back that claim up. It's frustrating to think about because we know McGucket is telling the truth, but because of his manic state, it was just written off as some spouting nonsense. And all the twisted, disturbing things that reside in Gravity Falls is why he started zapping his brain in the first place. I know he was going mad with power, but that's still so unfair to him. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. The status quo in Gravity Falls is miserable for him. Living in the town's junkyard with a makeshift home that's reminiscent of his old garage in Palo Alto. Though there's a lot of days where he wakes up in a random part of town and has no idea where he is or how he ended up there, like the golf course. Another instance where the themes of substance abuse and addiction become a bit more apparent. This man's a high IQ Frank Gallagher trapped in a Goosebumps novel. He also tries to cope with his loneliness with a raccoon wife, which according to a segment from Old Man McGucket's Conspiracy Corner, this is his favorite raccoon. Yep, the guy's seen better days. The citizens of Gravity Falls don't take him seriously, and they find him to be pretty harmless, despite his dangerous inventions and erratic behavior. The silver lining to this is that Dipper and Mabel treat him like a normal acquaintance, and after a while, a friend. It helps that he pops up on their adventures enough for them to develop a dynamic and become attached to him, despite his fractured mind. Fiddleford's still very resourceful, shown in moments like when he quickly fixes Dipper's lantern in The Land Before Swine. He also creates a voice-changing potion that he gives to Dipper in Bottomless Pit, which he actually created for himself so his voice would stop scaring everyone around him. That's a bit of a downer. I think what really drives home McGucket's suffering is what Bill had to say about his mind in the Book of Bill.
I peered into the souls of madmen, but this was the first time I'd been in a mind that was collapsing like a neutron star. Decades of memories were missing. Shards of emotional damage whizzed by like bullets. Some desperate part of him seemed to be trying to heal himself, hoping to weld his memories back together like one of his robots. But thanks to years of using his own brain damage ray on himself, his mind was scrambled into something even I couldn't decode. A single spark from the memory inferno hit me, and a hole sizzled straight through me like a laser through butter. For the first time, I felt a kind of pain that wasn't hilarious. I've heard enough overlapping banjo solos to last me a lifetime. I was out, and I never came back.
Just like he invented the mind erase gun to run away from his trauma, instead of processing everything he's been through, Fiddleford would continue to try and solve his problems with dangerous inventions, instead of being vulnerable and giving confrontation a shot. In The Legend of the Gobblewonker, he invented a mechanical yet lifelike imitation of the beast just to try and get his son's attention, hoping that if he finally proved the existence of something supernatural to the town, he could win back their respect and be welcomed back into Tate's life.
Did you ever talk to your son about how you felt?
No, sir, I got to work straight on the robot.
According to the tapes in his memory tube, he actually did see the real Gobblewonker, and the image of it was evidently burned into his brain, despite his attempt to forget. He's mentioned building a homicidal pterodactyl bot when his wife left him, which I can only assume was an incident where he was going to try and look like a hero by saving her, only to fumble and have the relationship end up in a worse state than before. He also built an 80-ton shame bot when his bud Ernie didn't come to his retirement party, which is awful, but also really funny. McGucket's still poorly following the advice Ford gave him over 30 years ago, that problems can always be solved with science. The flaw being that Fiddleford doesn't really want to solve the problem, he just wants to block it out. Although he's a lot more blasé in his old age, McGucket is still very paranoid and anxious of the supernatural and an end-of-the-world scenario, casually asking at Stan's Wax Museum reopening if the statues are alive and if he could survive an uprising. I really hope he didn't find out how this episode ended. Well, I guess he eventually did with Wax Larry King. Despite the town writing McGucket off as a crazy hillbilly, Dipper still takes note of his intelligence and engineering skills, suspecting that there's more to him than meets the eye, as shown in Journal 3. And he's not the only one who recognizes that McGucket is a genius, as Gideon would later enlist him to create a giant Robo-Gideon, which adds to how warped Fiddleford's moral compass has become, while also making everything so much sadder, because he probably felt a sort of comforting familiarity working as a lackey. Gideon might have actually enlisted him as a sort of servant before Dipper and Mabel even set foot in Gravity Falls, since he's rowing the boat during one of Gideon and Mabel's dates. It's speculated that despite his scattered memories, McGucket still recognizes Ford's appearance within Stanley, tagging along with everyone in the Land Before Swine, simply because a part of his mind is used to following this face around. He just doesn't know why. It is rough. But thanks to Dipper and Mabel, he's eventually able to take the first step to confront the past head-on in the path to recovery. Dipper's quest to find out who wrote the journals leads to him discovering that McGucket created a laptop that Dipper thought belonged to the author. Thus, Dipper jumps to the conclusion that McGucket wrote the journals because of course. The squad bands together to confront the inventor, but the interrogation doesn't go as planned, as the sight of the blind eye symbol triggers something in McGucket. Thanks to the gaps in his memory, he believes that the blind eye messed with his brain, painfully unaware that everything was self-inflicted. Though he's right in a very cruel sense. This escalates into the gang infiltrating the blind eye's headquarters in hopes of finding McGucket's memory tube, and McGucket ends up sacrificing his own well-being to save Dipper from Blind Ivan, taking a whole memory wipe to the face, only to discover that he's practically immune to the gun, due to how much damage his mind has sustained. The memory rays don't even faze him anymore. Recovering his memory tube allows McGucket to come face to face with something he tried to forget for the very first time. He witnesses his descent into madness, and he doesn't like what he sees at all. But he's glad he didn't shield himself from these memories no matter how painful they may be, because they're a part of who he is. And his identity has been a mystery he's been trying to solve for far too long. He needed to see this to truly pull himself back together. Moving forward, he also starts wearing gold glasses with green lenses, solidifying his place on the Bill Cipher Zodiac as the glasses. Although one of the lenses pops out, which I always believed showed how far along he is on his journey. He hasn't recovered 100%, but he's halfway there, and that's still worth celebrating. It's also a neat parallel to Ford's cracked lens. From this point on, McGucket begins to reclaim his sanity, signified by his hair slowly growing back. He's able to stay focused on his task, and he has better control of his erratic behavior, although he's shown to act like he's just a crazy hillbilly as a means of keeping a low profile. McGucket repairs the laptop, and it isn't long before his paranoia gets the best of him, running calculations only to discover that they're on the cusp of an imminent threat, something that could usher in the end times. Dipper disregards McGucket's warning, as he himself just had a near-death experience and wants to enjoy the rest of the night stress-free, which is fair, he's 12. But this leaves McGucket spiraling all by himself. Overwhelmed with anxiety, Fiddleford no longer wants to confront the past. As the portal is mere hours away from activation and the government swarms to town to arrest Stanley, Fiddleford nearly relapses and skips town, abandoning his makeshift home to lay low in the bunker, although this is never explicitly stated in the show. It was, however, alluded to by Alex during the mid-season 2 hiatus, probably because he knew we wouldn't see it on screen. And once the Weird-Mageddon arc began airing on TV, Disney XD gave us the Old Man McGucket Conspiracy Corner shorts, which saw our beloved hillbilly draw attention to background details in the show, while also dishing out crackpot theories. Mind-blowing if you weren't on Tumblr, vindicating if you were.
Cryptograms! Have you seen this mixed up gobbledygook? This again. I can read it, but I don't know what it means.
While I think in the real world, most people would look for shelter and lock themselves underground if they had the means, thinking an apocalypse was near, narratively, McGucket leaving is supposed to be a regression of his character. His absence in the second half of season 2 feels very intentional. It's easier for him to run away based off the possibility that something bad might happen, rather than sticking through it with his friends, his support system. They should be facing the future together. But old habits die hard. Maybe he was also written out the story simply so they could avoid having him reunite with Ford this soon. They had to hold out on the reveal that Ford and Bill previously worked together for a little bit longer, and if McGucket's in the picture, those beans are getting spilled sooner rather than later. We know his memory of Ford had to resurface before the events of the finale rolled around, so perhaps after he fled, he pieced everything back together in solitude. Even so, not getting any sort of McGucket-focused episode prior to Weird-Mageddon definitely left a weird taste in my mouth. We really got roadside attraction over a McGucket and Shapeshifter comeback? Lucky for us. Key and Carlisle and an amazing team of people created a fan episode that gives us just that. If you haven't seen it already, it's worth checking out. It gives a great idea of how an episode returning to the bunker could have unfolded. McGucket came out of the bunker every now and then, presumably to see if civilization was still there, witnessing things like the election for a new mayor. But otherwise, he was keeping a low profile. What I find really interesting, though, is that once Weird-Mageddon started, McGucket eventually left the bunker and sought refuge in the Mystery Shack, hunkering down with the surviving townsfolk and oddities. I think Weird McGucket had a lot going on, so they couldn't fit in everything they wanted. I mean, it's a technically 4-episode arc that was firing off on all cylinders. Very ambitious for the show, so I don't hold anything against it for not fitting everything I wanted to see in it. It just makes the existence of Rosehead Attraction look even worse. That being said, I do think McGucket leaving the bunker was a huge step for his character, and by skipping over it in the show, we missed out on a major moment of development for the lad. Weird McGucket is the worst case scenario for him. This is the end of the world. Fiddleford's greatest fear has come to pass. But he's come a long way. He understands that even if he can't control everything that happens to him, he can control how he responds to it. And so far, he's responded to almost everything by not really responding to it at all. He just blocks it out and acts as if it never happened. Fortunately, Dipper and Mabel showed him that there was another option, that you could confront your fears head on and come out of it alive. Fear itself is almost always scarier than what awaits on the other side. So McGucket is faced with two choices. He can stay down in the bunker, alone with no one but himself, just like it's always been, minus the murderous frozen shapeshifter, kinda just makes being down there worse. Or he can face his fears, find his friends, and use his brain to invent something that can fight back. Of course, we know he chose the latter. I think McGucket ended up at the Mystery Shack and joined Stan's resistance because he was already looking for Dipper and Mabel. He wanted to meet up with his friends and find a way to take down Bill. He just ended up beating Dipper and Mabel to home base as everyone but Stan got wrapped up in Bill's shenanigans. Given Stan's reaction to seeing the gang walk through the door, odds are he and the rest of the survivors thought the mystery twins kicked the bucket. Morale must have been low, and for a few days, McGucket must have felt hopeless. But at least he was with people, the townsfolk, and the oddities he tried so hard to forget. It's important to note that McGucket specifically showed up with refugees.
That's when Possum Breath over here shows up, leading a bunch of injured stragglers through the forest.
That means he was probably fighting alongside the supernatural residents of Gravity Falls while making his way to the shack. And that's heartwarming if you ask me. That's growth. If these were his final moments, he was going to embrace the things he didn't fully understand, defending those he tried to run from, atoning for not wanting to meet them on their level despite capitalizing off the resources they provided. Once Dipper and Mabel arrive at the shack and renew hope within the resistance, McGucket gets hit with an idea and soon after unveils his blueprints for an invention that could stand a chance at taking on Cypher, all while rescuing Ford, who's become his prisoner. As he binges copious amounts of anime with Seuss, McGucket and the resistance incorporate different aspects of Gravity Falls and form them into the Shacktron, a giant robot that embodies Dipper and Mabel's summer. Wasting no time to take on the hench maniacs and infiltrate the pyramid, the gang is able to save Ford in no time, leading to a long-awaited reunion between him and McGucket. Ford apologizes for his selfish actions, for derailing McGucket's life to service his own desires, albeit with fewer words because this finale only got like 44 minutes to work with. And McGucket's response perfectly sums up his entire arc.
I've tried forgetting. Maybe I should try forgiving.
Now, we all know what happens from here. Ford lore dumps about the Zodiac, presenting it as their last-ditch effort to defeat Bill, but because of his bickering with Stan, it fails, leaving them to defeat Bill by pulling the old switcheroo. Throughout this climactic showdown, McGucket, like the rest of the cast, doesn't really do much. He gets turned into a Toon Link-esque tapestry, and that's about it. His story doesn't end there, however. They don't just defeat Bill and he goes back to the dump of his raccoon wife. Business as usual. Against all odds, Fiddleford is able to achieve a happy ending. Journal 3 reveals that Ford made a proper visit to McGucket after things settled down, with Ford admitting guilt at the sight of McGucket living in the dump. It really caused the gravity of his actions to sink in. It's all water under the bridge though, as McGucket was overjoyed to see Ford. The two conversed for hours, with McGucket dishing out a ton of questions pertaining to Ford's adventures in the multiverse, which assured Ford that his friend is still in there and is recovering just fine. But he still felt indebted to McGucket. Someone with such a brilliant mind and a big heart shouldn't have to live like this. That's when Ford stumbled upon a collection of blueprints that McGucket just underplayed as doodles. In reality, Ford knew that these were futuristic machines that could change the world as they knew it, and insisted that McGucket submit them to the US government. So, remember when I said in the beginning how McGucket was on track to become loaded and successful? Well, he finally took different advice from Ford and got these blueprints patented, causing him to rake in millions and acquire what was formerly the Northwest Manor.
Well, I've moved in.
he also reconnects with his son, although it's unknown what happened between him and his ex-wife, Emma Mae Dixon. Maybe they eventually reconnected, maybe she already moved on.
Her aim is getting better.
It's up to your imagination. McGucket is someone who turned himself from a cautionary tale to one that's inspiring. He was someone who was dealt a bad hand from the day he was born and ended up throwing away his future after growing a dependency on something that was destroying his brain. But he learned to put his walls down and learned to trust people again. He learned to trust himself again. He learned from his mistakes, faced his fears despite it being the hardest thing in the world, and he was able to get up on his feet again. He believed in himself, and it literally paid off with his dreams coming back to life decades after he thought they were dead and buried in the ground. And throughout all of it, he still managed to retain some sense of self, as no matter what, he always had his banjo on him. He got a well-deserved happy ending that almost makes up for how tragic the rest of his life was. Almost. Bro had a raccoon wife. I don't want to think about those implications. Fiddleford rocks. Don't be afraid to seek help. Thank you to Janky Bones for drawing this portrait of Tate and his mom, and I'll catch y'all next time. Have a great day. Peace.